Hello, everybody. Good to see you all here this afternoon. My name is Michael McQuarrie, and I direct the Center for Work and Democracy here at Arizona State University. The mission of the center, if you don't know, is to engage in research and other activities that further the voice and power of working people in America. Before we start, I would like to make note of some upcoming events being hosted or supported by the Center for Work and Democracy. On February 3rd will be the opening of the Twin Flames exhibit of art, artifacts, and offerings that come from George Floyd Square and the George Floyd protests here in the Phoenix metro area. This exhibit is the product of a collaboration between the Center for Work and Democracy, the George Floyd Global Memorial, and the ASU Art Museum. More information on this is available on the center's website. Second, our annual conference will take place on February 23rd and 24th here on ASU's Tempe campus. The themes this year will be economic democracy and labor movement renewal. Our keynote speakers will be Kim Kelly, who's a leading labor reporter, and Kali Akuno, who is one of the leaders of Cooperation Jackson. Registration for the conference is open, and you can register on the center's website. Third, the center will be supporting the John P. Frank annual lecture this year in order to bring in Matthew Desmond to talk about his recent book, Poverty by America. That talk will take place on March 25th. Information about that is available on the School of Social Transformation website. Finally, we have upcoming talks by SST Professor H.L.T. Kwan, Brown political theorist Diva Woodley, and SST Professor Rashad Shabazz that are all part of the Twin Flames speaker series associated with the exhibit at the ASU Museum. These will be advertised on our social media channels and on our website, and we hope to see you at those upcoming events. On to today. Today's talk grows out of a conference on the politics of the Green New Deal, which was organized in 2019 by the chair of the center's board, Craig Calhoun, and the center's associate director, Benjamin Fong. Our guest today, Todd Vachon, was one of the speakers at that conference, and in the time since then, he has published a book on the politics of climate justice and labor, which he will be talking about today. Todd Vachon is Assistant Professor of Labor Studies and Employment Relations and the Director of the Labor Education Action Research Network at Rutgers University. Joining Todd for this discussion will be Craig Calhoun, who is the chair of the Center for Work and Democracy's advisory board. Craig is the University Professor of Social Sciences at ASU and holds a number of joint appointments at ASU. He is co-author of Degenerations of Democracy with Charles Taylor and Dilip Gankar, and is co-editor with Benjamin Fong of The Green New Deal and the Future of Work. Please join me in welcoming Todd Vachon today.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Craig, and thank you to the center and all of the staff for having me out back to ASU. It's been a number of years. As Mike mentioned, I was here in 2019 for the Green New Deal conference, and it was a great experience. It was my first time arriving in Arizona, and I thought I'd landed on Mars, being a New Englander. It felt like a different planet. The terrain, the climate, just everything around was just so new and different to me, and it's a delight to be back after 4 years, and it's hard to believe that it has been 4 years. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my book, which is based a bit on the research that I presented at that conference, but it's really derived from more than a decade of participant observation. And I got to tell you, one of the things that happens when you publish a book, you get interviewed on radio shows and podcasts and things, and probably shouldn't have been surprised, but I guess I was caught off guard when the first person who asked me said, "So Todd, why did you write a book about labor and climate change?" Seems like the most obvious question ever. So I kind of paused for a minute, and I realized, well, the answer is actually a pretty deep history answer for me, a deep personal history answer. And I came up with the conclusion in my mind that it really stems back to 1989, right? So for some of the students in the room, may not have been around yet in 1989, but I was a middle schooler at the time. And a couple important things happened in 1989, right? So at this point in time, I'm a 13-year-old. I lived in eastern Connecticut, a rural area of Connecticut. And my father owned a small gas station convenience store here called the Maple Shade, right? And so our family's business was the business of selling fossil fuels and gasoline, right? My dad actually used to drag race this 1967 Chevelle Super Sport, and that's little me sitting in front of it right there. It was a hell of a car, 800 horsepower car, off the line, 2 seconds, quarter mile. Incredible, right? So this is my childhood in 1989. But another important thing happened in 1989. Dr. James Hansen went and made a presentation to the US Congress about the phenomenon known as the greenhouse effect that would cause global warming. caused predominantly by the burning of fossil fuels going into the atmosphere and trapping heat in the Earth's atmosphere, leading to long-term warming of the planet, which would ultimately lead to what we now call climate change, right? So in this same year, in 1989, we have the scientists telling us that burning fossil fuels is going to have catastrophic consequences for the planet. Also, my father's fossil fuel business was beginning to struggle, right? We were a small one traffic light town. The highway was never completed and it ended in our town, so we benefited from everybody having to get off the highway and drive by the gas station. Well, they decided they were going to finish the highway, and then they just started to build a 7-Eleven near the highway exit ramp. So we were facing bankruptcy and foreclosure of our family home. My dad, fortunately, he was a volunteer in the local fire department, and one of his fellow firefighters was a union carpenter. And he said to him, look, we're working on constructing this power plant down the road, and we need a lot of new people to get into carpentry. You should go down to the union hall. And he did. So in 1989, my dad, in his early 30s, did a career change from being a small business owner to becoming a union carpenter. And I can tell you, the transition from that period of 1988 to, say, 1990, our family was uplifted into the middle class. The union wages, the health care benefits. My dad is now retired. He's been retired since he was 61, right? He's now 73. He's been enjoying retirement for 12 years, enjoying his grandkids, my children, spending time with them because of the union job that he got. But again, that union job, that first entryway into the Carpenters Union, was constructing a natural gas-fired power plant, right? Again, a fossil fuel-driven job opportunity that brought home the bread for my family to live off of. So fast forward a little bit, I graduated high school in '94. I actually ended up going through the Carpenter's Apprenticeship program myself and becoming a union carpenter as well. That's a picture of me. It's obviously very grainy because it's before digital cameras. I was working at the nuclear power plant, right? I worked at the local nuclear power plant whenever they would have a shutdown to refuel the plant. When they take out the old uranium and bring in the new uranium, so they shut down the whole plant so it's not making electricity, and all the workers come in to fix everything. And what carpenters do is we build the scaffolding. We called ourselves scaphologists. Well, I ended up going on from being a scaphologist to a sociologist, thanks to a little event that happened in 2008 and 2009 that we now call the Great Recession. The recession hit, and my father and myself and everybody else in the skilled trades was unemployed, past the point where unemployment benefits had expired. Again, my father facing foreclosure on the home for a second time. He was able to save it, thankfully, to some other side jobs and things like that. But at the time for me, I was a young parent with a 2-year-old and a 1-year-old, and one on the way. And my very intelligent wife said, you should go back to college. You're always reading all those damn sociology books and labor history books. Why don't you go back to college now? So I did. I went back to college, and when I arrived at UConn, I discovered this thing called labor education, which really spoke to me. I didn't know that there was a way that you could be an educator for working people about how to build power for working people, right? So I discovered the Labor Education Center. I ended up staying on through a PhD, and along the way helped organize the Graduate Employee Union and served as the first president of the Graduate Employee Union at the University of Connecticut. Now it's in that role as the president of the union, the first president of the union, that I really started to connect the dots between labor and climate. Why? Well, we won our first contract and won great improvements for the workers, for our fellow coworkers, and then we decided to poll the members. Said, look, we are now a large local union of the United Auto Workers in a blue state, Connecticut. We have some political influence at the government, at the state government level. What are the issues that you all, the members, care about? So 2,100 graduate assistants, teaching and research assistants. And the number one issue, climate change. So I'm a local president, my members are cared about climate change. I have children, I care about climate change. I start figuring out how can I get my union involved in climate work. And I discovered a group in the state called the Roundtable on Climate and Jobs, which brought together labor groups, environmental justice groups, green organizations, and faith-based organizations to try and consider ways that they could partner. Where was their common ground to try and find solutions to the climate crisis that would both ensure that we don't go off a cliff, a climate cliff, but also we don't throw workers under the bus along the way, that we ensure that the green jobs are good jobs and that workers that lose their jobs will be taken care of. So that is what I started doing, and I was working on a dissertation at the time, and I was doing so much activist work. My advisor says to me, you're doing so much work on all this activism. Maybe that should be your dissertation topic. So thus, it was my dissertation topic and now my book. So that's just a long way to give you the backstory, but I think that's important, right? Because my lived experience is reflective of the lived experience of so many other workers. And you can understand why there are so many working people who have fed their families by having good paying jobs in the fossil fuel industry that are really worried about the solutions to the climate crisis, undermining their ability to take care of their families. But the data shows us that dating back from the end of World War II forward, we've seen two mega trends that are interconnected. One is the rise of income inequality, thank you, and the other is the rise of greenhouse gas emissions, right? So the blue line here for us shows us the global carbon emissions from 1950 going up. It rose from 5,000 to about 36,000, so that's a six-fold increase in carbon emissions over this period. At the same time, the top share of income going to the top 1% went up from around 8 or 9% in the 1970s up to about 23% today. So the top 1% of earners are taking home 23% of the income today, right? Massive amounts of inequality. And one of the big drivers of rising inequality is the decline of unions, the decline of bargaining power of workers in the United States. And these things are not, these things are related, right? They're not just coincidental. The world's top 26 billionaires have more wealth than the poorest half of humanity. But also the top percent of earners in the world contribute more than 50% of greenhouse gas emissions based on consumption, right? They own multiple houses, giant yachts. They have yachts that go inside of yachts with helicopters on them, right? I mean, they are using fossil fuels at a rate that cities and countries and states use fossil fuels, right? So they're mega contributors. And then you don't even need to get into how much they invest and own in stocks in companies that are extracting and burning fossil fuels. So that's the data. So today I want to talk a little bit about, from my book, some of the major points here. I'm going to talk about what I feel are the major pillars of support, why we're still using fossil fuels, a little bit about the history of labor and environmentalism. I'm going to place the labor movement along a spectrum, different industries, where they are situated in terms of supporting or opposing climate measures. And then I'm going to talk about the labor climate movement and what they're trying to pursue, which is a just transition. All right, so major pillars of support for fossil fuels. I identify 5 of them, really. The first one is pretty obvious, the fossil fuel companies themselves, right? They make their profit from extracting, processing, transporting, and selling fossil fuels for profit, right? They are really opposed to phasing out fossil fuels because they still have a lot of money under the ground that they want to dig up and sell and put in the pockets of their investors. Second one, fossil fuel using industries. So you have to think about manufacturers of products that use fossil fuels in the end. Think of like ATVs, motorcycles, pickup trucks, right? We're starting to see more electrification of vehicles, but there's still a lot of products that are made and manufactured that use gas in the end. But also plastic, right? How much of what we consume is plastic, right? I was just handed a plastic water bottle here to give a talk about sustainability, right? We can't get away from it. It's everywhere. It's in the carpet that we're walking on right now, right? Those companies that manufacture products with plastic's a derivative of fossil fuels, they have an interest in there being a readily ongoing supply of cheap fossil fuel products for them to produce the products that they make and sell. A third pillar of support are the fossil fuel consumers. That would be us, right? Even those of us that don't want to consume fossil fuels are still get upset when the prices of things go up, right? If there's one issue that Democrats, Republicans, and independents can all agree on, it's when the price of gas goes up, everybody gets pissed off and is angry at the governor and angry at the president, regardless of what party they're in, right? Everybody agrees that rising gas prices is hurting all of us. But that means that we want to keep gas prices artificially low, right? We want to have government subsidies and ways to keep gas prices low. Gas in Europe has been $11, $12 a gallon for decades because that's actually the cost of burning gasoline. We, through government subsidies, keep gas prices artificially low. Third is the politicians. We have elected officials that are obviously influenced because of our political system by all of these other pillars, right? Especially in states that have a large share of their state economy dependent on fossil fuel extraction. So the coal mining states, the oil refining states, right? Those industries are supporting the candidates that are going to support them. And if you try to run a candidate that says we're going to get rid of fossil fuels in a state like Louisiana, they are going to get so much money flooded in the campaign against them that they're not going to have any chance of winning, right? So the politicians that are supported by the industry. And then the final one is the fossil fuel workers themselves. So this is the one that I look at in the book to consider what's a way that we can chisel at this pillar and weaken it, right? The idea of bringing down the fossil fuel use is that all of these pillars need to be chiseled away so that it collapses, right? Because they're supporting it right now. So the fossil fuel workers obviously want to remain employed. So their interest in it is keeping their jobs. But the difficult thing underpinning all of this is that we have this powerful free market ideology in the United States. You guys familiar with the word neoliberalism? I think it's a pretty household word nowadays. But the notion being that government intervention in the economy is bad, right? We should let the market take care of everything. The market is going to solve everything for us. Well, the market has not solved climate change. The market is arguably the cause of climate change, right? It's the need for endless growth that is driving us off a cliff, right? You can't have endless growth in a world of finite resources. And those resources include breathable air and a livable climate. So, where has the labor movement been in terms of environmental issues? So interestingly, there's a really mixed history. If you just watch the news media coverage, you always get those flashy jobs versus the environment stories, because that's what journalists like to do. Things that are like, if it bleeds, it leads. Like, oh, look, the tree huggers and the union guys are beating each other up. They love to tell you that story over and over and over again. But the other stories we don't think about, so the United Auto Workers and the United Steel Workers, right? United Auto Workers were one of the biggest supporters of the Clean Air Act back in 1970, which created the Environmental Protection Agency, right? The United Steel Workers in 1948 became tremendous advocates for clean air protections and scrubbers on the smokestacks at factories because the pollution was killing their members who lived in the community around the factory, right? The Denora death fog of 1948 is a very important historic moment. Some say that the birth of the environmental movement was actually within the labor movement, the modern environmental movement, because before that, environmentalism was conservationism. It was preserving wild space so that we could have nature. It was the labor movement that brought in the concern for human health and safety. And we fast forward to the 70s, the modern movement started to bring those two things together, right? But labor was the first really organized group of people to say, pollution is killing humans and we need to do something to protect humans from pollution. But there are still many reasons why we find unions opposing environmental protections. So these are kind of 5 of the main ones that I identify. I'll just be really brief. The main one is disparities in bargaining power. Workers in the fossil fuel industry have been unionized for 100 years or more, right? They have bargained contract after contract after contract after contract so that their wages are very high, their benefits are very high, and their pensions are very good. Labor law in the US since the 1950s has been eroded and shifted the power back to employers to oppose unionization. So all of the new industries that have arisen since then have not achieved the level of unionization that the fossil fuel industry has had because it organized in a period when it was, I don't want to say easier, but you could successfully organize a new union in the late 1930s and early 1940s in a way that is incredibly difficult to do today in 2024, right? So the workers have a lot of bargaining power in the fossil fuel industry. And the fossil fuel industry itself also understands the value of that. So they reach out to unions proactively and say, we want to build a pipeline, and we want to use union labor if you guys use your political support to help get this project passed. And then on the other hand, we have solar companies owned by Elon Musk who are busting unionization efforts. So I'm a union worker. I could go get $12 an hour for the Solar City company, or I get $60 an hour working for ExxonMobil. Kind of a no-brainer, right? Second is the dearth of good job alternatives. You lose your job in fossil fuels, you go look at the labor market. There's not a lot out there without a college degree that's going to pay even remotely close to what you're getting working at the fossil power plant or as a coal miner. Job blackmail by employers. This was really big after the Clean Air Act was passed. Employers would actually threaten workers to oppose environmental protections. They would say, look, if that passes, we're going to have to lay everybody off and close the plant. So you better write your senator and tell them that we don't want to put scrubbers in the smokestack. We don't want clean air protections, right? So the employer's actually threatening the employees to take action against their own interests in order to protect their jobs. Fourth, we have a very weak social safety net, and this becomes really important if you compare efforts in Europe versus the US, right? In the US, when you lose your job, you don't only lose your source of income, you lose your health insurance, and not only for yourself, but also for your family and your dependents, right? You're no longer contributing into a retirement program if you're not working and paying into it, right? All the benefits that we have are employment-based. So when you lose your job, you lose everything. And if you have a good job with good benefits, you can see the incentive for really fighting like hell to preserve that job, right? Now, in the European context, you lose your job, you still have your health insurance, you can go back to college for free, you're still going to have a public pension retirement plan, right? That part of the equation is taken out. So you see less resistance to transitioning away from fossil fuels in countries that have stronger social safety nets. And finally, there has been a bit of a history of environmental elitism where environmentalists literally show up at factories and like clog the vent ports and say, keep the pollution inside, which of course is killing the workers inside who say, environmentalists are crazy, right? They're not all that way, but there have been enough instances of that image is burned into the mind in many local unions. All right, so where does labor stand on climate change? So this is based on an analysis of unions' political stances, either in support of or opposition to legislation, as well as quotes by union presidents in these various industries to kind of put together the unions by industry along a spectrum ranging from what I call the jobs versus the environment frame to the clean air and good jobs frame. Not surprisingly, the extraction unions, like in mining and oil drilling, are very much opposed to climate change measures. But as you come across the spectrum, you start to see, the whole labor movement is not blue-collar workers, right? We have a lot of white-collar workers and pink-collar workers. Healthcare unions have been some of the most proactive in terms of being supportive of climate change efforts and climate justice efforts. Why? Well, think about what they're doing. Every time there's a massive storm and there's a catastrophe, who's on the front line? Right? And also seeing the increased asthma rates, and they're also dealing with the pollution health effects, right? But also there's another important distinction here too. You might start to notice that there's a bit of gender and race disparity along the spectrum too, if you think about how people are sorted into jobs because of the structural racism and sexism of our society, right? Lower paying jobs in the service industry, lots of women, lots of people of color. These jobs predominantly white males historically, right? People that are of lower income and people that are of color are more likely to experience the environmental burdens, right? You think about what environmental justice means, right? The injustice is that the people that are least well off and contributing the least to the pollution are actually experiencing the greatest harm from it because of the siting of polluting plants in low-income neighborhoods, right? Because of just various structural features that ensure that the least well off are getting the greatest harm and the most well off are basically blind, right? So we see that play out in this spectrum as well. So service sector workers, education workers, public sector workers, much more in support of climate protection measures than the building trades and the mining workers. Now, confederations is like the AFL-CIO. This is umbrella groups that lots of unions are members of. Not all unions. There are some really big, important unions like the SEIU that are not members of the AFL-CIO. But within the group of unions that's in the AFL-CIO, the building trades have a powerful voice in shaping the direction of the organization because they have a confederation of their own, of something like 30 unions that themselves as a voting bloc are so powerful within the confederation. And the threat of leaving would bankrupt the confederation, right? So their voice is disproportionately represented in the viewpoints of the AFL-CIO. All right, but that doesn't mean there aren't unionized workers that are out there really trying to do something about climate change. So what I look at in the book is what I call the labor climate movement, and this is the grassroots climate activists within the labor movement that are trying to press their unions and the labor movement overall to be proactive on climate change, right? To say, look, somebody's going to have to do something about climate change at some point in time. If working people and unions aren't at the table to shape what that something is, the old saying is, if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu, right? That's something I heard many times. So why are we not at the table ensuring that the solutions to climate change are pro-worker, that they build in protections for workers that are going to lose jobs, that they build in labor protections for the new green jobs to make sure that they can become good jobs like the fossil fuel jobs have over decades and decades of organizing. So the labor climate movement has been growing in different levels in different spaces, and I look at three groups in my book. One is a local level one is a national level one, and one is an international level one. But one of the major things they all talk about in terms of the solution to the problem is, I'm going to skip over these because I don't want to take too much time, we don't have time for conversation, is a just transition. All right, how many people have heard the phrase just transition? All right, I love that, because I can tell you, when I gave talks and said that 5 years ago, nobody knew what it meant, right? It's really started to gain traction, right? It's becoming a household word. But it was new to me when I started this research in 2012, 2013. I'd never heard of it. You know, I'm doing participant observation, I'm interviewing people, I'm hearing just transition. I'm like, so what is just transition? What is this thing? So I decided to just explicitly ask people, what is just transition? That became one of my research questions when I was interviewing participants. The concept originates from the work of this man right here, Tony Mazzocchi, who was a leader in the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, which then became part of the steel workers. He represented workers that worked in very dangerous, dirty occupations. He also represented workers that built nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles. And he, famously said, look, I need to make these jobs go away because we don't need to blow up the world, right? But I need to do it in a way that the workers aren't paying the price of it, right? Because they need to feed their families. It's not their fault that this job creates terrible death, human-killing weapons, right? So he had the idea that there's a super fund for dirt. There ought to be a super fund for workers. You know what the super fund is? A factory closes as a polluted site. The government has a pool of money, and the employer pitches in money, and they clean it up to make it usable land again. Why don't we do the same thing that when a plant closes and all those workers lose their jobs? Why don't we have a pool of money to ensure that they can still pay their bills and they can get retrained and reemployed, right? Have a super fund for working people. So that's the initial origin of the concept of a just transition. But when I started interviewing my participants, I found out that not everybody agreed on what they meant by just transition. There was different kind of framings and usages of it. So I call these three protective, proactive, and transformative. The protective one is really a lot like what Tony Mazzocchi laid out, a super fund. It's a set of labor market protections that creates a social floor for workers that are displaced in the event of environmental policies that are going to make them lose their jobs, right? It's localized and it's somewhat reactive. It's on a plant-by-plant basis. You have protections in place. You have a pool of money ready to go. This plant closes. We can have something in place for those workers, right? But I found other people took a little bit more progressive stance, and they used what I would call a proactive frame of just transition. And these were folks that said, not only do we need to have protections for workers when they lose their jobs, but we need to proactively, as the labor movement, shape what decarbonization is going to look like. So it's not just protecting the workers that are displaced, but ensuring that all of the new jobs going forward can be good jobs, right? This is the notion of a Green New Deal, which we all became familiar with in 2019, but I had people I was interviewing saying Green New Deal back in 2012. The term can be found as far back as 2007, right? The idea of a proactive government plan, a lot of people said a World War II style buildup to prepare to address climate change. So massive public investments, but a seat at the table and a voice for workers is the important piece here. And then the third frame that I heard, I call the transformative frame. This one was definitely the most radical of the three, and it aligns a lot more with the usage that climate justice and environmental justice activists use when they talk about just transition. It's saying, look, the root cause of this really is our capitalist economic system. We need to get past an exploitative economic system And we need to not only protect the workers and proactively come up with a plan to decarbonize, but we need to address the historical legacy of sexism, of racism, and of exploitation of workers. So what is a post-capitalist sustainable economy going to look like? What are we going to transform into? So if you put the three of these side by side, you'll notice they're actually nested within each other, right? So one of the things I consider is how the different supporters of these frames are trying to get other activists in the movement to move one step further in that direction, right? People that are proactive are trying to get the protective people to be proactive. People that take the transformative frame are trying to bring the proactive people to be more anti-capitalist. So you can see all of them agree on protecting workers, but you get a little bit more, and by radical here, if you remember I showed the pillars underpinning everything was that free market ideology. Each one of them is increasingly challenging of that free market ideology, right? This is a simple, we need to raise taxes and have a benefit for workers, right? Taxing and spending is anti-free market, sure. This is industrial planning. Okay, economic planning, that's really anti-free market. This is, let's get rid of capitalism. You can't really get more anti-free market than that, right? So it's just becoming increasingly radical in its challenge to the free market ideology. All right, so the final thing I want to end on is just considering the importance of the interrelationship between labor justice and climate justice. This is something that was a point of contention in a lot of my research with a lot of my participants of to what extent are we going to build alliances with environmental justice groups, many of whom feel that the labor movement has excluded communities of color historically. I think it's so important that we build those alliances. I don't think we can have a just solution to the climate crisis that doesn't both address environmental justice issues and also labor concerns, right? If we just recreate a green economy that still has the same structural racism in it, we haven't solved the problem, right? We need to make a truly sustainable economy that addresses all of that. So where are we now? Well, I would say progress has definitely been made. I can see everybody here said they heard of just transition. That wasn't true 5 years ago, right? The Green New Deal came out as a program like that everybody in the whole country now knows the phrase Green New Deal since 2019, right? But also even more recently, we look at the AFT, my union, we've passed a number of resolutions. We supported the Green New Deal, as did the SEIU. But we've also just passed a resolution in September to demand President Biden declare a climate emergency and stop all new fossil fuel projects, right? That's a pretty big step forward for an AFL-CIO member union. The United Auto Workers was demanding a just transition when they are on strike. And that was actually one of the big things they won, was that the battery plants that make the batteries for electric cars would fall under the master contract and get the same wages and benefits as the regular auto workers get in the fossil fuel plants, right? So that's a real important win, right? So now that helps us move forward to making electric cars and ensuring that those workers are being paid well. There's been a lot of various state level policies. Colorado, just up the road from here, created an Office of Just Transition for coal workers. They're still working on getting the funding into it, but they have a director and they have an office that's developing a plan that will be like a protective just transition for coal workers as the coal industry continues to decline. So, prospects for the future. We're in an election year, right? We got a lot at stake. It feels like every election is the most important election in our lives, right? We hear that every stinking year. Can't say that, we've had the best pro-climate, pro-worker leaders, but we could certainly envision worse ones. So I think a lot is riding on what happens coming up later this year in terms of what direction we're going to go in on both labor justice and climate justice. And I will wrap it up there. I'm probably a couple minutes over time, and thank you all for listening.
My foot's gone to sleep.
Was I talking that long?
Todd, thank you. And thanks for the occasion to the Center for Work and Democracy, to Michael. Let me just preface my remarks. Great book, get one over there. You can have the value-added signature.
Yes, I'll sign it for you.
This will increase its oratic value in the many, many future. But it really is a good book. And it's a good book both as a sociological study of social movements and as a politically engaged look at a field of activism and policy making that's really important in the country. So I think it succeeds on two different dimensions that don't always come together, right? The academic analysis and the activist-oriented engagement. So I have no deep criticism. I was looking for a fatal flaw so I could give you this kind of, if only hits this. Not there. There's no fatal flaw. There are a bunch of points to raise, most of which are questions that simply go beyond this. Well, how else do we take this forward? I'll come back to the place where Todd ended his talk at the end of my remarks and say, well, where are we now? What's really happening with the idea of a Green New Deal, with the other parts of climate politics in various ways? But I want to get there through a few other things. And I'm going to make this a series of questions, each of which is prefaced by a little bit of engagement with Todd's analysis and all of that. The first thing I want to say about this is there's a good historical chapter. And it's important that there is, because there's a bunch of inherited conditions that shape the prospects for labor activism and particularly for a labor climate movement in this. And so I'll underscore some that Todd mentioned in his remarks today, like the fact that we don't have universal health care. Right? This is not just a fact of nature about the United States. This has a history. It has a history in which unions have been among those pushing for universal health care. But I'll note it also has a history that isn't brought out as much, but I think is relevant, that Todd will agree, of the dominance of an earlier era of manufacturing unions, transportation unions, and a few others that negotiated very strong point of employment health care. So what we had was a regime of majority health care in the US where the mediator was union negotiated contracts with a kind of big business that changes. So to the specific history of the labor movement, I would add this larger history, which differentiates the US from Europe and from some other countries, of our weak welfare state as playing into that. And here I'm going to turn to one of my questions about the history part before we go on to the more current. It seems to me that a huge bit of this history is the story of deindustrialization, globalization, and technological change as they played out, particularly from the 1970s, slightly different dates, and that we're set up for the predicament of labor today and parts of the predicament of organizing the environment by that. So we have this 1970s crisis of energy and inflation and jobs, because the way that the United States chooses to fight inflation is on the backs of workers by essentially damaging the labor market in order to bring down inflation. Should be a little bit familiar today. Now, so I'd like you to go there. I know you know about all this. It's not foreign to your argument, but how does it matter that we have this specific history of deindustrialization, globalization, transformation of industry for how this particular story plays out?
Sure. Great question. And just a quick comment based on where you started with this.
When I said it was a really good book.
Well, that it's the sociological and activist made it challenging to get a publisher that would an academic publisher that wanted to do it, right? I had a number of publishers say, you're too much of an activist, we can't publish this out of an academic press. But thankfully, Temple was willing to take it on. So yeah, deindustrialization, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why this is important in the equation, right? First and foremost, I think, the rising inequality that has contributed to, because so much of the union density in the country was in the manufacturing sector, right? That erosion of good jobs left us with, we had rising public sector unionization starting in the 1970s because labor laws began to pass in that sector at that point in time. But the private sector unionization rate shrunk precipitously so that there was just fewer and fewer good unionized jobs. And guess which ones were left? The defense industry and the fossil fuel industry, right? That are just two monopoly industries with tons of government support, right? There's just not a lot left in the private sector. UPS is like your big private sector union, contract right now. So that just left those workers that still had blue-collar unionized jobs even more defensive of protecting those jobs and industries because those other alternatives were not there anymore, right? You could have graduated high school in 1970 and gone to work for an oil company, a coal company, a Ford plant, a Chevy plant, and you would have had a good union contract and you could have bought a house and had one income to support your family. Now you got rid of 3 or 4 of those options, right? Now it's just your fossil fuel jobs. So that just changes the matrix, the decision-making matrix, and it raises the stakes for those workers to protect and defend those good benefits jobs. I think it also, both politically, how the government, and this has a lot to do with your comments about us not having a social safety net, how the government dealt with all of those mass layoffs and job loss has created a very reactionary element within the working class, right? There's, the vision of having progressive solutions where the government is promising to fix things, but there's a history of the government promising and never delivering anything when workers lose their jobs, right? Richard Trumka, the former president of the AFL-CIO, famously said, "Just transition is just a fancy word for funeral," right? Because when globalization and deindustrialization happened, the government created these programs that would help workers, but everybody just ended up getting, 2 community college classes and a job at Walmart, right? That's basically what the US government provided for its transition for those displaced workers. So understandably, a lot of mistrust in promises for the government to solve the problems of workers because the government has revealed over and over again that it's captured more by the interests of big business than it is by the interests of workers. And that's further compounded by deindustrialization because the organized political voice of the working class has been eroded and shrunk further and further and further. I don't want to go off too much on a tangent, but that's why you see so much political attacks, right-wing attacks on public sector unions now, because that's kind of the last political stronghold of the labor movement to influence pro-worker policies, right? The private sector is only 6% unionized now. Only 6% of private sector workers have a union. You can argue that we barely have a labor movement in the US in the private sector.
So let me pick this up and come back in this. So I think everything you said is sound. I want to add in a couple of things to it. So we have this triple whammy of globalization, deindustrialization, technological transformations going on. We have minimal and problematic government response to it, which makes people suspicious of the idea the government can fix their problems for them. And here you have a characteristic of the Green New Deal proposals to bring out, which is that they depend a lot on the federal government as a change agent.
Yeah.
You mention in the book local Green New Deals that are negotiated, but just sort of a little bit in passing. But it seems to me that it's an important feature of the way that activism around the Green New Deal has taken shape. That's literally looking back to the Roosevelt-era New Deal and thinking we need very large-scale government intervention at a moment when there's very little trust in that at federal government. The second thing that comes out of that, it seems to me, is another movement analysis frame. We'll come back to that. You have you rely a lot on analysis of frames, how things are framed that are core, and political opportunity structures and all of this. But there's something conjunctural here, something literally historical. Does it matter, I'll make this a question, but just to sort of short, does it matter that the timing of this deindustrialization, globalization technology wave and environmentalism coincide so much as they do? That you've got sort of a 1970s takeoff, late 60s, 70s takeoff of an extremely destructive set of changes for the labor movement and manufacturing industry in the United States, and of an environmental movement that's going to get a lot of attention that come together at this point.
I'll add a third piece to that pie also, the rise of, the decline of Keynesianism and the rise of neoliberalism as
absolutely.
the
Same
dominant
timing.
governing ideology. So we have really government disinvesting from regulating the labor market and providing social benefits. We have the rise of environmentalists fighting against, the production of polluting facilities, the construction of nuclear power plants, and then we have all of the manufacturing jobs. So yeah, it's a confluence of
So all this
terribleness.
So I just want to put on the analytic agenda, in a sense, alongside factors like the fight over cultural frames or political opportunity structure, these conjunctural patterns. In a certain way, history matters that these came together.
Yeah.
The suspicions of the environmental movement sort of matter. It seems to me, another hypothesis to ask you about, that there's some interesting divergences that come out of this. They're going to set up some divisions among different politically active people. From this point, right, you might look back nostalgically, but you shouldn't overdo the nostalgia about the post-war boom and the stronger position of unions in the economy, manufacturing. But one of the things that did was suggest that movements could embrace several different agendas and work together. So unions and civil rights movement wasn't a great success, but it wasn't a complete failure either. There's a lot of interconnection. What you get coming out of this, it looks to me, and this is my question to you, is increased separate organization, separate organizational structures for activism on different agendas, combined with different demographic profiles. So the environmentalists, and especially as they become climate change activists rather than the original environmentalists, begin to look like white college-educated kids. And that's not what the union activism looks like. It's not what black activism looks like. It's not right. You can go through that. And so we get an environmental movement which is peopled by essentially people who are a lot like us in certain ways.
Right. So silification, right? These movements become siloed, and like you said, it's very much racialized and also economically sorted, right? You have upper white middle class folks in the environmental movement. The environmental movement also became less grassroots in the 1980s. It became really a fundraising machine and hired lots of lawyers. And it's a lot about lawsuits and, less about the grassroots activism that it used a lot in the 70s when you saw more partnerships between labor and the environment. It was when the environmental movement was more grassroots in an organizing fashion of the way that labor is. But yeah, no, I talk about in the book how the three targets of the labor climate movement are the labor movement itself, to make the labor movement itself be more proactive, the government to create policies that will address climate change and protect workers, but a third target is the mainstream environmental movement itself, right? Because these are folks that are just fighting for solutions to climate change, but do not understand the importance of work in people's lives and don't realize the job destruction that those policies that they're promoting. And I do see, as part of the changes, I see that environmentalists talk a lot about jobs and unions now, which they didn't 7 or 8 years ago. So that's a step forward. They want to know how to talk to unions, though. They're talking about unions, but they're not working with unions necessarily. There are some groups, and I don't know if you're going to get to this, I don't want to preempt you, but that bring together labor and environment.
Well, these are your core focus. You're calling the labor community.
But this is a group that I call the Blue Greens. So if you read the book, I say there is a big group called the Blue Greens. Within it is the labor climate movement. And the major difference is the Blue Greens are just pro-growth. We'll build renewable energy. Yes, we will support it. But as soon as you say we need to close the fossil fuel plants, they're not touching that with a 10-foot pole, right? Nothing about decarbonization, but all about green growth, right? So it looks like it's a blue-green coalition to address climate change. It's just a pro-growth in the green sector of the economy coalition, right? There's nothing in those groups that is about phasing out fossil fuels. They do not touch that or talk about that in any way.
Right. So, though, as long as there are new employment generating possibilities and new technology. So we can build Teslas.
Right.
Right? And create jobs building Teslas or other electric vehicles or something like that. And keep the discussion that way, even though it has within it and this is also good for the environment and so forth claim. But is there a change in this? I think there is. So I'm asking you whether I'm right or I'm wrong in this. Or I'm going to put two together just to speed up the questions. Two changes that also seem to go along with that. One is that the environmental movement, the climate change movement aren't the same thing.
Right.
And the shift into a climate focus has several differences. One of them is it's way more globally led. It's even more the white college educated activists, and it's even more the model of activism that is centered on trying to change policy at centralized locations rather than grassroots. So that there's still an environmental justice movement, right? But it's not very connected to the climate change movement. So just saying environmentalists through this whole 50-year period, it seems to me masks that we've got a shift between a movement that called itself environmental and was focused on that, which had its problematic relations to manufacturing industry. Best way to clean up the Hudson, close the plants upstate, right? But was focused on environment. And environment had a stronger pull towards place. That the climate activism is almost intrinsically global. You're looking at these models about carbon emissions and weather in a global climate. That climate's intrinsically global, right? Whereas some environmental activism, at least, was very local, which gave it better prospects for relations with labor. Didn't always work out. Sometimes they just fought locally, but sometimes they made alliances.
Right.
Better prospects for relationships, say, to racial or ethnic minority communities that were the disproportionate victims of dumping or other kinds of environmentally damaging action and so forth. So is this change a factor here?
A bit, but there's even tensions within that, right? Excuse me. The environmental justice movement arose because the environmental movement itself was very white and not focused on the justice issues. And in fact, a lot of times the injustice was a result directly of the NIMBY, the not in my backyard activism of affluent white environmentalists saying, we don't want a trash incinerator in our town. No, no, no. So we're not going to build it in Montclair, we're going to build it in Newark, right? And there it is, sitting right there next to the community of color. So that's how the environmental justice movement arose. We also have the climate justice movement, which is similarly situated as a response to the majority climate change movement, right? The climate justice movement is bringing in those issues of structural racism and disparities. So it further silofies and creates a more complicated field of players, of actors that need to be brought together under one big tent. So there's a lot of organizing work to be done.
A lot of organizing, a lot of more, you have to write another book, right? So you've got a lot of analysis along a spectrum, labor climate spectrum. You gave us a shot of a picture up here, in which we can look at different kinds of unions and where they stand on being progressive in the climate. It seems to me there's a similar differentiation around kinds of environmental or climate action, and even between environmental and climate, that complicates that, and that figures on it. So I implicitly brought in one other thing there. Let me make it the focus. In your last chapter, where you're sort of pulling out what are some of the major findings, 2 of the 3 major findings are in the frame analysis. We'll come back to the frame. But the third, 2 of the 3 are on political opportunity. We'll come back to that. The third is around alliances and relationships. Right? So you set up 2 main foci for your analysis, frames, kind of cultural politics and how that works. So absolutely with you, crucial. And you've given us an account here of protective, proactive, transformative, all of that, right? And the political opportunity structure then turns out to matter really crucially. What's the outside political opportunity structure? And so that's at the core of what you want to talk about, and I'll ask more questions about it before we open up the audience. But what I want to ask about is you then sort of say something that hasn't been as, at least seemed to me, as much the focus through the book, though now it's one of the major findings, and it has been there, it's been mentioned. That's alliances and relationships. And you say that the core of the labor climate mobilization that's going on, bringing together labor and environment, that's obvious, the name, and faith-based activism, right? So it points to another dimension of organizing, of support, which can be thought of as a source of resources, people to mobilize. So I know a little bit more about that and what's happening with faith-based, but also what about race-based mobilization? You've got a discussion of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter and things, but throughout this, what about the place of race-based mobilization on various issues, and potentially a longer list that are not under the headings labor or climate, but are nonetheless active mobilizations of people to change society, which then matter as alliances.
Yeah. Well, just on the alliance front, what I discovered in general, just one key takeaway, is they are way more successful at the local level, right? You hinted at that at the beginning of your remarks just now. I find that the most successful alliances are really like at the municipal level or sometimes at the state level, where activists know each other, can actually get to know each other, and can find shared interests and campaigns to work on. But the political opportunity structure that, like you mentioned, so when the George Floyd protests happened, it actually shifted a number of folks that were taking a proactive frame from labor only, saying we need to protect the workers that are going to lose their jobs. And they'll say it like this, because if we don't, they're going to vote for Trump, then we're never going to be able to fix climate change anyway, at all, right? So those racial issues are a different problem that we need to worry about later, right? But the George Floyd protests really opened up a lot of people's eyes in labor that then said, you're right, we do need to incorporate those environmental justice, climate justice demands into our just transition discourse. So the presence of that movement, right, that it came onto the scene so powerfully and so eloquently with its demands and just educated the public on an issue that, those that knew, but that a lot of people just were blind to. I think that created opportunities and spaces for those alliances to broaden their demands and to deepen their relations. So I think that that's incredibly important. But that was a political opportunity, right? That's something that happened. In the absence of the George Floyd shooting, would these activists have come to embrace fighting structural racism as part of the climate solution? Maybe, but it's hypothetical. I don't know for sure. But I can say that this event and the response to it certainly brought those two movements into a space together in a way that they hadn't before.
So movement organizing and attempts to change frames of thinking in all of this necessarily play out against opportunities, political opportunities.
Yes.
And they shift and they move and we seize them. We could even say, I think, about that moment of Black Lives Matter, it's not appearing out of nowhere. It is a reappearance of something that had been pushed to the back pages that now gets back on the front pages, right? And so this question's there. And that maybe an important finding then to pull out, another thing, is the success of any movement depends on an overall field of what a bunch of movements and organizations are doing. And that if you just look at labor and you ignore everything else, you just look at race and you ignore everything else, you just look at religion and ignore everything else, you miss the extent to which it is in fact the field of activism which goes through the history of these different phases.
Yeah.
So, all right, we got an agreement. I'm going to close out with one last set of questions that I said about. I think the political opportunity structure account is really good. You bring in a variety of factors. I'm in the interest of getting to audience questions. I'm going to skip over a bunch of this. And note that you rightly bring in the impact of the Great Recession. You mentioned it here, your biographical story too. That material economic conditions are changing and are part of what's going on here and are shaping the opportunity structure and shaping the potential for mobilization organization. And the Great Recession, the financial crisis, huge impacts and bifurcates. But it also has a big, plays not the original role, but a big factor in making more extreme the political polarization of the country. So my question to you about this is, how is the literal politics of this election year, but also the more general polarization, affecting political opportunities and chances to do this work of trying to shift frames? If part of what polarization means is increased pressure on people to align with other people who are on their side. They're on the left or they're on the right. Does it make it harder to say, well, I'm on the left on this, but on the right on that, and I'm mixed, right? Is there a pressure? And I think we've seen a lot of push for large parts of the working class to line up on the right, and people try to say, well, I would have voted for Bernie Sanders, but the Democrats didn't nominate him because I really do care about economic change. But push comes to shove, I care more about being a racist than I care about economic change, so I'm on the right, or whatever the issue is, right? Is this polarization in the way of continued progress here?
Yes. Short answer, yes. I think it complicates things, certainly. The tribalism, it's not only that it's polarized, but it's very tribalized, right? They're sorting into an us and them mentality. Certainly undermines solidarity. The history forever of exploitation, like how do a few people control the masses? You divide them up and have them fight amongst themselves. It's a very simple social control method dating back thousands of years since the first civilizations, right? Colonialists arrive and they see there's 3 different tribal groups. They treat one nice, they treat one crappy, and then have them fight among themselves, and they can steal all the resources, right? So it's essentially the same, same thing happening now. It undermines our solidarity to see our common interests. I do think that, another piece that complicates this is our political system sucks, to just put it bluntly, right? We don't have a 2-party system, but we effectively have a 2-party system, right? The plurality electoral results, that whoever gets the most votes wins rather than who gets 50%. The fact of that leads us to have Democrats and Republicans rather than 6 or 7 different parties, which you might have in other countries that have rounds of elections or runoff elections. Because it is difficult if you're, what if you're a socially liberal person but an economically conservative person? Which party do you vote for? You're pro-gun but you're pro-union. Which party do you vote for, right? Like, people are divided, then they're forced to figure out what their one most important issue is to choose which candidate they vote for. And that's terrible. I mean, it makes for no good policy and no good government and no solutions to anything really to come about. How do we fix that? I don't know. That's beyond me right now. It's a change the Constitution, have a revolution.
I have the answer. No, I don't have the answer on how we fix it. But I will suggest it has particular relevance for the centrality of framing argument. It fits perfectly and reinforces the political opportunity argument that lining up 2 tribes, 2 polarized positions, feeling you can be only one or the other, and that maybe you align yourself over time more and more with one, fits your, one part of the argument. The framing argument seems to be necessarily entangled with an analysis of media and money and the political system in general, as you just said. And that's not a criticism of what's in the book, but it's a suggestion that it's a limit to trying to pursue movement building by frame change if you can't get access to media on fair terms, money to pay for different sorts of campaigns, right? And it suggests an inevitably political mission for the labor movement or the climate movement or any of these who have to work. There's just no choice now to work on it, on these issues in ways that transcend traditional labor understandings. If you think you have to change these frames, and so raise all these questions about what about non-unionized workers? What about other people? The larger, what about tactics that are directly political rather than?
Well, regarding the framing in media, it's 2 things really. It shows, one, how powerful framing is, but also the limits to it, because the nature of our media consumption now is so bifurcated as well. It's also so polarized.
Yeah.
Since the rise of
Exactly.
cable news, people turn on the news source that matches their preconceived notions, their ideology, and then it reinforces. Social media looks at what you clicked on, it sends you further and further down that rabbit hole of, but it's a really, really powerful frame that people are getting when they enter that rabbit hole and they get deeper and deeper down it, right? People that are following that rabbit hole down, it's like it's all because of immigrants and all because of black people and it's all because of this, right? That's framing at work. That shows you the power of framing it, that everybody's consuming it, that we have people storming the Capitol on January 6th as a result of how reality has been framed for them. It drove them to action, right? So that the framing is important. It's just how do you break across that polarized barrier to have a frame that influences people on the other side to understand the shared interest in addressing climate change.
Yeah, and it's just possible the most powerful social movement in the United States today is not any of those that we are considering
right-wing
progressive
movement,
here.
yes.
But it's a movement. It's not just the power structure of big business or something. It's a movement. I want to close out by saying, as you get your questions around this, a nice frame that Todd gives us for thinking about this is a potential movement from climate alienation, a useful concept for thinking about this, to climate solidarity. And a lot of what we've been talking about is the challenges to achieving that solidarity, but it's a good frame for trying to think about this. So thanks for that, and thanks for the book as a whole, Todd. All right, I think it's time for people in the audience to ask questions.
Oh, thanks. I wanted to ask you how the movement now, the agenda to reduce the power of regulatory agencies in like environmental protection, worker, laws and such, and the discretion and the case before the Supreme Court right now about fishing. Where is that going to figure in to this effort?
Right. So, I think part of the argument that I laid out here about that underlying neoliberal ideology, that's in line with that, right? The notion of markets fixing everything is deregulate, right? Get rid of taxes, get rid of regulations, get rid of government agencies, and let the market handle everything. But I try to demonstrate, I think I demonstrate in the book, that the only way we can actually solve the climate crisis is through having some form of concerted, presumably government efforts to regulate how we use and consume energy and what types of energy sources we utilize, right? Because if we leave it to the market alone, we're going to burn the world up, right? It's going to require some forms of regulation. So the efforts to undermine regulatory agencies are both anti-environment and anti-worker. So should be a point of shared interest, right? Ensuring a functioning government that regulates the economy to protect its citizens.
What I was also getting at here is there are many problems with the way our regulation is done, like co-optation, et cetera, that happens. So this might also be an opportunity for social movement organizations to rethink regulations. It's going to be challenged. Is there a way, like in the case of the Fisher people, I haven't followed it super closely, but there's some rationales there that they were making the fishing people pay $700 or whatever for the inspectors. And so there's part of a problem about social class and the size of the business, the kind of business. And so this might also be an opportunity, although right now the threat is scarier.
Yeah. No, I agree. Our regulatory system is definitely leaves a lot to be desired. I think it's certainly better than not having a regulatory system, for sure. Some would argue that it's often designed to fail on purpose to undermine public support for regulatory systems, right? You can create a regulatory system, right? We create the National Labor Relations Board. The president, every time there's a new election, gets to staff that with people. So when it's under a right-wing regime, the National Labor Relations Board is not protecting workers, it's protecting businesses, right? And then it goes back and forth. But it's a regulatory board, and it's imperfect and flawed. But yeah, we're considering new ways of doing that. I do know there's always been efforts in the health and safety activism of unions and workers to create ways in which workers themselves can enforce regulations, right? So rather than having agencies enforce them, empower the workers themselves to enforce the rules on the job site. This is dangerous today. We're not working.
Hi, being that moving the economy more towards purchasing services and experiences is really the most sustainable way of handling things rather than buying more and more manufactured goods. How can we do that and have high-paying jobs?
Yeah, right. Unions. I mean, if you look back in time at fossil fuel workers, coal miners, those were terrible jobs in the 1880s. The death rate was through the roof. The pay was horrible. You know, breathing in the soot, getting black lung, having mines collapse, not even making enough money to pay your family. It was through organizing unions and going on strike. And at that time, a lot of times getting shot down by the National Guard for going on strike, because it was before we had federal labor law. But those are the ways that workers were able to build power. So we absolutely need changes in labor law to allow workers to organize unions and to go on strike in the way that we had between 1935 and 1950 in this country. It was a very short period where we actually had power as working people, right? Now, much of those tactics that were used at that time are considered unlawful since the Taft-Hartley Act in the 1950s. But also the reason why so many of those jobs that you just described, right, the caring jobs, teachers, nurses, service jobs, predominantly feminized and paid nothing, right? The history of patriarchy and seen as that's just an extra job, right? The real jobs are the jobs that the men are doing to bring home the bacon for the family, right? So yes, switching to a more green economy is going to mean not just switching from fossil fuels to solar. It's going to mean changing our activities to be more service-oriented, right? Not a things economy, but a relations economy, right? We also have an aging population. We need to care for folks. We have a teacher shortage. Nobody wants to teach public school because it's a terrible paying job, and everybody wants to beat you up and blame you for everything you do, right? We got a lot of work to do, but I agree. We need to empower. I'm working on a chapter right now, actually, talking about a just transition in the context of how do we make all of those jobs be as good as the fossil fuel jobs.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on that question and ask about gig work. A member of the Center for Work and Democracy, Mia Payredu, she's sitting in the back, she wrote this really fantastic master's thesis a couple of years ago about how do people who work in the gig economy organize. And so, we have this like fundamental problem that's created by technology. People who work in the gig economy, they don't work anywhere. There's no location. Mm-hmm. There's no place that they go. So, the research is sort of examining that, like how do you organize these workers? But at the same time, these workers are also deeply wedded to the fossil fuel industry because, they're not driving electric cars, right? They're driving, whatever fossil fuel car they can get affordable car, right? And then it also has these deep gender and race implications because we see a lot of women working in these industries, Black women and other women in particular, people of color, first generation immigrants, right? So there's a way in which all of these things are converging, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'm just really curious, right? How does the labor movement organize workers who are not placed anywhere, right? Mm-hmm. Who are just sort of roaming around the city, and also these workers are deeply connected. They need the fossil fuel industry in order to sort of sustain their jobs in the way in which you talked about, people working at various other fossil fuel agencies, and also like how technology is fomenting this, mm-hmm. right? That it's allowing for people to just sort of be anywhere and be able to work and be a part of this sort of labor movement without necessarily being located anywhere.
Right. I don't want to go too far down the future of work kind of avenue, but I always question who's developing the technology and in whose interest is it in, right? It's not working people developing these gig apps, right? It's capitalists finding ways to maximize exploitation of workers. So you're not my employee anymore. You're an independent contractor. I don't have to give you health insurance. I don't have to pay unemployment insurance. You work for yourself, but I pay you, and I keep some of it, right? I mean, it's a maximum exploitation. But it's not without precedent. Like, the gig economy has been around for a very long time. We talk about it as if it's a new thing. My former occupation as a carpenter, gig worker, right? The way we organize the construction industry is through hiring halls. I worked for 70 different employers over my years as a carpenter. I would get hired to build a hotel, then I'd get laid off and be on unemployment for a few months. Then I'd get hired by a different company to build a casino, then I'd be laid off for a few months, right? The union is a hiring hall of members that then connects them to job opportunities as they arise, but it bargains the wages across the entire industry. The music industry is that way also. Professional musicians, actors as well, right? So there's models for what unionization can look like in a gig economy that have been around for 100 plus years. But trying to organize those workers into a union under the current labor law is very difficult, right? And I think it's further complicated because, like you said, the technology has us even more atomized. You're on your phone by yourself. Like you don't even see somebody else that's an Uber driver unless you're in line at the airport together, you know. Yeah, I wish I had a better answer. There's a lot of smart people working on it though.
So I have a question about, you had that slide up. It was very interesting showing the unions in different sectors aligned with where they were on the spectrum.
You want me to put it back on?
You don't need to, but it is about that. I'm curious in the conversations you had with workers, union leaders, members. One thing when I was looking at that, I was like, okay, the ones that are the furthest to the side are the furthest distant from the actual energy sector. Mm-hmm. And part of that's like just self-interest of your job. Mm-hmm. Some of it's also like having a sense of how the job actually works, right? And having some connection to like knowing how the industry operates and some tighter pride in that work. So I'm just curious if that tension in the conversations you had with members, union leaders, if that came up.
Yeah.
Like, we're getting criticism from the workers who are disconnected from our work.
Oh yeah, one of the things that you would hear is skin in the game, right? So people that work in fossil fuel industry would actually berate the nurses union, say they have no skin in the game. They're not going to lose their jobs by supporting that policy to address climate change. We are, right? They're undermining labor solidarity by supporting climate protection measures that are going to throw us under the bus. Right, so it starts to create not only is there different opinions, but it's actually tension and sometimes division, right? Some people would even say, well, the AFL-CIO should just split in half. We should just have two different confederations, one that wants to be progressive and one that's the construction workers, right? So yeah, but then there's also that a lot of workers that come out of fossil fuels feel like they take a lot of not only pride in their work, but it's like an identity. Right? Like what I do is dirty and dangerous and not glorious, but everybody else can work because of what I do. Like I am the square one. I'm the base of the entire economy. If I don't go to work and produce energy, nobody's driving a car, nobody else is going to work, nobody has lights to turn on, right? So there's that sense of like pride and importance in the job also. And I think the thought of then going into like retail or something feels like you're going to lose that also. Not only are you going to lose the pay, but you're going to lose that feeling of like I am a very important contributor to the economy, even though I'm a blue collar worker, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm just curious what you make of that as like a reason for resisting or being in a different position, having been a carpenter. And
yeah, well,
pride in work.
It's real, and I think it's legitimate. I mean, people have feelings for all different reasons, and everybody's entitled to their feelings for genuine reasons, right? I just think we need to have more conversation between different people to come to understand the situation, like define the situation, as we say in sociology, right? And really, people that are on the pro-climate side need to understand those workers' perspectives as much as those workers need to understand that we need to address climate change. But the problem is the groups are not talking to each other mostly.
Yeah. Can I take the moment to connect that question to the Director's previous question about gig work and to the historical discussion? So one of the differences among different genres of unions, different sectors in the economy, different kinds of work, is how spatially concentrated they are. So extractive work, for example, is highly spatially concentrated. Mine workers are together with other mine workers. So one variable making organizing easier is, do the people you're trying to organize know each other? Mm-hmm. If they all live in the same community, work in the same place, there's a mine and they're sort of set apart. So they both know each other, and they constitute the majority of the community, or at least a very large part of it, so their mindset. So that then also becomes a reinforcement in the context of this environmental thing. You can think, yeah, all of us in this together are going to be victims of that bad environmental policy or whatever it is. Just as all of us in this together need to fight the mine owners. And you could produce another kind of continuum from how much the nature of work and employment as it's currently organized produces a concentration of workers with each other and an ability to know each other. So some who are not entirely spatially concentrated do have a lot of resources for knowing each other. So your ASCAP members.
Yes.
And so forth. But one of the transitions away from one aspect of deindustrialization and the rise of service work is a dispersal of workers into a variety of spatially dispersed settings in which they aren't the majority necessarily in any one of them.
Yeah. So I should send you the draft of my not the draft. I should send you my dissertation, because in the
I'm
book
always looking for more
in the
dissertations to
book
read.
publishing process. So that spectrum I showed you was originally a field. I used Bordeaux, and the publisher's like, you're introduced to too many theories here. It was a Bordeaux field, and the vertical, I used Stinchcomb's organizational forms to think about the organizational forms of different unions, and it looked some of that on geographic concentration, racial diversity, and you found that actually the spectrum went up as a perfect 45 angle, like this also. So it was, not only is it that they're, more diverse up there, that they support climate change, but it also has to do with the nature of the structure of the unions themselves. But
And let me put in a plug for your publisher. They may not have wanted that particular more theoretical academic
it was the
craft,
reviewer, not the publisher.
but-
one of the reviewers.
But Temple University Press has a pretty distinctive niche as having been serious about publishing work at this interface of academic and activists for a number of years. And it's important. I mean, a previous director who built a lot of that, but it continues.
Yeah. Very thankful for it.
Any more?
I wanted to ask a question about gender and the new better jobs, the good jobs. Will they be designed in a way that will promote opportunities for women, particularly women of color, who are concentrated in the service sector jobs? And anytime the word technology is used, it already, like, bells go off in my mind, because women haven't had the access to the kind of sophisticated technological training that many of these new positions might entail. And so I just wondered, like, are there any connections to activists in the women's movement as well as the civil rights movement? Because building these alliances, they're necessary, okay? And that's the only way we're going to change anything in a significant way. But each of these movements, they have a history, and it's really hard there to bring them together because of that history. Even though women are, dominating certain sectors of the labor movement now in terms of not numerical numbers and leadership, but there's still a way in which and I don't want to essentialize this, but I think women bring a certain kind of experience from their work to these to the labor movement and it's the work they do is more based on care and relationships, and those are the kind of skills that we need in the new economy. But yet there's kind of a disconnect, I think, between that history.
Yeah.
That's not really a question.
No, I think you kind of answered your first part of the question with the last comment, which is, I think, the jobs that we need to be emphasizing and building out are the jobs that are already predominantly occupied by women and women of color, right? Those are the jobs of a green economy, but because they're predominantly women and women of color, they don't pay well because of all of the historical legacies that you're hinting at. So what can we do to make those jobs be good jobs, right? How do we help those workers to organize? How do we ensure there's equivalence of what these occupations have, prevailing wages and project labor agreements and different labor market protections that those unions in the blue collar industries have won over the years to make sure those are good jobs? What's the equivalent set of policies for, nurses and home health aides and service workers to ensure that those jobs can be family sustaining jobs?
Look how quickly we abandoned the attention to the social infrastructure in favor of the rebuilding of the physical infrastructure.
Got thrown right under the bus instantly.
Yeah, throw it right under the bus.
Yep. Yep.
I'll take a quick addition to Mary Margaret's comment, which is also worth realizing that most jobs in so-called tech sector are not high technology jobs. They are high touch jobs. They are content creation jobs. They can even be sweatshopped as low end jobs in call centers supporting an industry that has a high tech part.
Mm-hmm.
Also, when you were talking earlier, both of you, a bit about siloing and so on, and one area where there's lots of research seems to be coming up, even by sociologists, looking at the health data and environmental racism. And a friend of mine that's in Louisville has been doing research in this area and looking at the health effects, and they are definitely class and racialized.
Yep.
And there's been quite a backlash on the part of his university for his work, because the big funding source for that university happens to be a manufacturing plant that's very much a polluter in the area. But this has potential, it seems to me, for local movements and inclusion of not just people that are like us, that are poor, working class, and people of color, and it also helps with the interface between working and care work, paid work and unpaid care work, because when the water is destroyed in a community, it affects the children and the future and all of that, and it just seems like that's an area where there could be a real intersection.
Yeah, I agree.
So this is unfortunately the end of our time, so the last comment, but it's a good comment for the last comment, partly because it orients us to a positive future as well as to problems we face. One of the good things about Todd's book is that it does that it is not just a litany of all of the problems. It does give us an orientation to a positive future. We need that orientation to be successful activists and to confront and build that future. Thank you, Todd. And thank you all for joining us.